Let us close our eyes once more and allow our minds to become still, like a calm ocean surface reflecting a boundless sky. We journey now not through deserts of sand, but across vast expanses of deep, ancient water to a place that exists more in whispered legend and fleeting dream than in the charted world. We are seeking the island of Atlantis, a jewel of the primordial sea, a civilization said to have shone with unparalleled brilliance before vanishing without a trace. Imagine a time long, long ago when the world felt younger, more mysterious, far out in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which marked the very edge of the known world. For many ancient peoples lay this grand island. It was said to have been given by the gods themselves to Poseidon, the mighty lord of the sea, earthquakes, and horses. And here, Poseidon, in his wisdom and power, established a domain for his mortal offspring. He chose a hill on the island, and with his divine engineering, he sculpted the very land and sea around it, creating a place of perfect order and breathtaking beauty. He broke the ground and encircled this central hill with rings of sea and land, one after another, like ripples spreading on water. There were 3 rings of water, it was said, and 2 rings of land, perfectly concentric, keeping the central island isolated and protected. These rings were made so precisely that no ship could easily approach the innermost sanctum without specific knowledge or guidance. The distance between each ring, the width of each channel of water, and each intervening strip of land were all set down with a divine geometry, creating a harmonious and defensible pattern. The central island itself, where the royal palace and the most sacred temples stood, was not vast, perhaps 5 stads in diameter, a stade being an ancient measure of about 600 feet, but it was the heart, the very soul of Atlantis. Here, Poseidon was said to have loved a mortal woman named Cleito, and she bore him 5 pairs of twin sons, 10 sons in all. These 10 sons became the first 10 kings of Atlantis, and the island, along with other territories, was divided among them. Atlas, the eldest, was given the central island and overall sovereignty, and the great ocean surrounding their world was named Atlantic in his honor. The land of Atlantis was blessed with extraordinary abundance. The main island itself was large, and beyond its ringed capital lay a vast and fertile plain. This plain was described as oblong in shape, sheltered by mountains that rose near the sea. These mountains were celebrated for their number, size, and beauty, surpassing all others known. They protected the plain from the harsh north winds and were home to many villages rich in resources. Springs, both hot and cold, gushed forth from the earth in abundance, providing water for all needs, for drinking, for bathing, for irrigating the gardens and sacred groves. One spring of cold water and one of hot were particularly noted for their constant flow and the quality of their waters. And around these, baths were constructed, some open to the sky, others roofed over for winter use, with separate facilities for royalty, for common citizens, for women, and even for beasts of burden. The soil of the plain was rich and deep, capable of yielding 2 harvests a year, thanks to the benevolent climate and a sophisticated system of irrigation. A great canal, described as 100 feet deep, a stade in width, and 10,000 stades in length, was dug around the entire plain, collecting water from the mountain streams and from the rivers, and then distributing it through a network of smaller, transverse canals that irrigated the fields. These canals were also used for navigation, allowing timber and other produce to be floated down from the mountains and across the plain to the city. The careful management of water resources was a cornerstone of Atlantean prosperity, a task undertaken with meticulous care and generational knowledge. The island produced everything needed for life, and much more besides. There were dense forests in the mountains providing an inexhaustible supply of timber for building and for fuel. Various metals were mined from the earth, not just gold, the most precious, silver, copper, and tin, but also a mysterious metal unique to Atlantis called orichalcum, which was said to flash with a fiery light and was considered second only to gold in value. This orichalcum was found in many parts of the island, and it was used extensively to adorn the temples, palaces, and even the great walls that surrounded the city rings. The very name, orichalcum, perhaps meaning mountain copper or shining copper, hints at its metallic luster and origin. The island also yielded fragrant plants, resins, and spices, fruits of all kinds, both those that could be dried for storage and those that provided pleasure and drink, grew in abundance. There were grains for sustenance and vegetables of every sort, even the fruit that is difficult to store, perhaps a reference to bananas or other tropical produce, thrived in the Atlantean climate. The land was so fertile and the ecosystem so well managed that it provided amply for a large population of both humans and animals, including herds of elephants, which were said to roam the island. The city of Atlantis, the capital, with its concentric rings, was a marvel of engineering and artistry. The kings of Atlantis, over many generations, built upon Poseidon's original design, sparing no expense and striving to outdo one another in the grandeur of their works. They cut canals through the rings of land, wide enough for a trireme, a warship with 3 banks of oars, to pass through, and roofed these canals over so that ships could sail directly from the outer sea into the central harbor, which was carved out within the innermost ring of water next to the Acropolis. Bridges spanned these canals, connecting the rings of land. The walls that encircled each ring were of monumental construction. The outermost wall, which ran around the largest ring of land, was said to have been coated with brass. The wall of the next inner ring was coated with tin, which gleamed like silver, and the wall of the innermost ring, the one that directly encircled the Acropolis, was said to flash with the red fire of orichalcum. Imagine the sight from the sea or from the mountains, a city of concentric, glittering bands of color rising from the water under the bright Atlantean sun. Within the central Acropolis stood the royal palace, a structure of immense size and intricate design. It was here that the descendants of Atlas lived and ruled. Also, on the Acropolis was the most sacred temple, dedicated to Poseidon and Cleito. This temple was described as being of barbarian or non-Greek splendor. It was a stade in length, 300 feet in width, and of a proportionate height. Its exterior was entirely covered with silver, except for the pinnacles, which were covered with gold. Inside, the roof was made of ivory, curiously wrought with gold, silver, and orichalcum. The walls, pillars, and floor were lined with orichalcum. Within the temple stood colossal golden statues, Poseidon himself, standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, so tall that his head touched the roof, and around him 100 Nereids, sea nymphs, riding on dolphins, for this was the number of Nereids that people in those days believed to exist. There were also many other golden statues dedicated by private individuals. Around the temple were sacred groves and gardens irrigated by the pure spring waters. The laws of Atlantis, established by Poseidon himself, were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum, which stood in the center of the island within the temple of Poseidon. These laws governed the relations between the 10 kings and their respective kingdoms. Every 5th and 6th year alternately, the 10 kings would gather at this sacred pillar. Here, after solemn rituals that included the sacrifice of a bull, captured without the use of iron, only with staves and nooses within the sacred precinct, they would deliberate on common affairs, judge transgressions, and renew their oaths of allegiance to the laws and to one another. The pillar also recorded that they were not to take up arms against one another, and that they were to come to each other's aid if any king were attacked. Each of the 10 kings ruled over his own portion of the island and its people, and had power over many other islands and parts of the continent. As Plato's account vaguely suggests an Atlantean empire, but the overall governance of the Federation of Kingdoms rested with this Council of 10. The Atlantean society was highly organized. Each of the 10 kingdoms was responsible for providing its share of resources for the common defense and public works. The Great Plain alone, with its fertile soil, was divided into 60,000 lots, each lot assigned to a worthy man and responsible for supporting a quota of military personnel and equipment: a chariot, a charioteer and warrior, 2 heavy armed soldiers, 2 archers, 2 slingers, 3 light armed stone throwers and javelin men, and 4 sailors to make up the crew of 1,200 ships. Such numbers, if taken literally, suggest an immense population and a military power. The bureaucracy required to manage such a system, to record the allotments, to collect the dues, and to organize the logistics of the Army and Navy, must have been extensive and meticulous. Imagine legions of scribes carefully noting down every detail on scrolls of papyrus or perhaps on clay tablets in a script now lost to time. Imagine overseers methodically checking the maintenance of the canals, the repair of the roads, the construction of public buildings. The lives of the Atlantean citizens were, for a long time, characterized by virtue and moderation. They were said to despise everything but virtue, not caring much for their present possessions of gold and other valuables, but bearing them easily as if they were a burden. They were not intoxicated by luxury, nor did wealth deprive them of their self-control. They were sober and saw clearly that all these goods are increased by virtuous friendship with one another, and that by excessive pursuit and admiration of them, the goods themselves are ruined, and friendship with them Such was the character of the Atlanteans. As long as the divine nature, inherited from Poseidon, was strong within them, they lived in peace and harmony, their days filled with purposeful activity. There would have been the farmers, tending their fertile plots on the great plain, carefully managing the irrigation waters, planting their seeds of wheat and barley, tending their orchards and vineyards. There would have been the herdsmen, guiding their flocks and herds in the upland pastures or on the plains. The forests would have resounded with the sound of axes as woodcutters felled timber, which was then carefully transported to the city via the canals. In the quarries, stonemasons would have been painstakingly cutting and shaping the blocks of white, black, and red stone that were used to build the houses and public buildings, each stone chosen for its color and texture, creating pleasing and varied patterns in the architecture. In the city itself, craftsmen of all kinds would have been busy in their workshops, potters shaping clay on their wheels, producing vessels for storage, for cooking, for religious rituals, perhaps decorated with geometric designs, or scenes from their mythology, or images of the abundant marine life that surrounded their island. Weavers creating fine textiles from flax or perhaps from wool, their looms clacking rhythmically. Metal workers, skilled in the arts of smelting, casting, and hammering, would have been fashioning tools, weapons, and ornaments from copper, bronze, silver, gold, and the precious orichalcum. Goldsmiths and jewelers would have been creating intricate pieces for the elite, perhaps inlaid with colored stones or enamel. Education in Atlantis must have been highly valued, particularly for the ruling class and the priesthood. Young Atlanteans would have learned the history of their island, the laws laid down by Poseidon, the genealogies of their kings. They would have studied mathematics and geometry, essential for their engineering feats in building canals, bridges, and perfectly aligned structures. They would have observed the stars, charting their courses with patience and precision, developing a sophisticated calendar to regulate their agricultural and religious cycles. Perhaps they had observatories on the mountain peaks or on tall towers in the city, where priests and astronomers spent long, quiet nights mapping the heavens. Their philosophy might have centered on the concepts of order, harmony, and the maintenance of Ma'at, much like the Egyptians, but with their own unique Atlantean interpretation, perhaps focusing on the balance between the divine and mortal natures and the responsibilities that came with their blessed situation. Their religious rituals would have been conducted with great solemnity, aimed at honoring Poseidon and the other gods, ensuring their continued favor and preserving the cosmic balance. Imagine the great processions through the city, the chanting of hymns, the offering of sacrifices in the magnificent temples, the air filled with the scent of incense and the sound of sacred music. The great harbor within the central ring, and the outer harbors as well, would have been bustling with activity, but an orderly bustle. Ships would have been arriving from other parts of the Atlantean Empire, or perhaps from distant lands for trade, laden with goods, metals, timber, foodstuffs, exotic animals, textiles, pottery. Dock workers would be unloading and loading cargoes, supervised by harbor officials. Merchants would be negotiating deals in the marketplaces, The canals themselves would have been thoroughfares, with barges transporting goods between the different rings of the city and to and from the Great Plain. However, as generations passed, this idyllic state began to change. The divine portion of their nature, inherited from Poseidon, gradually became diluted as they intermarried more and more with mortals. The human, mortal part of their character began to assert itself more strongly. That original virtue, that sobriety and moderation, began to wane. They became filled with unrighteous avarice and power. They started to value wealth and material possessions for their own sake rather than as mere tools. Ambition grew. The harmony among the 10 kingdoms may have frayed. Perhaps the laws inscribed on the orichalcum pillar were subtly reinterpreted or increasingly ignored. This decline was likely a slow, insidious process, not a sudden collapse. Perhaps it began with small compromises, a slight bending of the ancient rules. Perhaps their great engineering projects became less about serving the community and more about ostentatious display of power by individual kings. Perhaps their trade and expansion, which Plato mentions, reached as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia, Etruria in Italy, became more aggressive, more exploitative. The discipline that had built their great civilization might have hardened into a desire for control, for dominion over others. They were, it is said, preparing to wage war against the peoples of the Mediterranean, including the ancient Athenians. As their moral character declined, so too, perhaps, did their wisdom in managing their relationship with nature. Their immense city, with its complex systems of canals and land reclamation, was, after all, built upon an island in a geologically active part of the world, under the dominion of Poseidon, the earth-shaker. Perhaps their advanced engineering gave them a false sense of security, a belief that they could control the very forces of nature. The end, when it came, was said to be swift and terrible, though preceded, one might imagine, by warnings that went unheeded or misinterpreted. Perhaps there were minor tremors over the years, unsettling the foundations of their glittering city. Perhaps the great springs that fed their baths and gardens began to behave erratically. Perhaps unusual tides or storm surges lashed their coastlines more frequently. Their priests and scientists might have recorded these phenomena with their usual meticulousness, debated their causes, offered propitiations, but failed to grasp the true scale of the impending catastrophe. Or perhaps their warnings were dismissed by a ruling class now more concerned with power and conquest. Then, as Plato recounts, in one grievous day and night, disaster struck. There were extraordinary earthquakes and floods. The very foundations of their island world were shaken. The carefully constructed rings of land and water, the mighty walls, the gleaming temples and palaces, all were overwhelmed. The sea, which had been their protector and sustainer, became their destroyer. The island of Atlantis, with all its inhabitants and its magnificent civilization, was submerged, sinking beneath the waves, disappearing in the depths. The great plain, the protective mountains, the bustling city, all vanished as if they had never been. Where once had stood a beacon of power and artistry, there was now only open, empty sea, perhaps for a time made impassable by shoals of mud where the island had subsided. And so Atlantis became a memory, a legend, a cautionary tale recounted by ancient philosophers about the dangers of hubris, the corruption of power, and the fall from grace. A story of a lost golden age, a paradise lost to the depths, perhaps preserved only in fragments of folk memory, in tantalizing hints in the myths of other cultures, or in the deep, quiet archives of the ocean itself. The exact location, the precise details, the ultimate truth of Atlantis remain shrouded in mystery, a subject of endless speculation and longing. But as we allow our thoughts to settle, we can picture that lost world, not in its final, violent demise, but in its long centuries of ordered existence, the slow, methodical construction of its canals and temples, the patient cultivation of its fields, the meticulous keeping of its laws, the quiet observation of the stars. We can imagine the gentle lapping of water in its many channels, the distant hum of its workshops, the solemn chanting in its temples, all the rhythms of a highly organized and for a time virtuous society, resting now in an eternal, silent embrace beneath the vast, deep waters of the ocean, a stillness that echoes the stillness we seek, a profound, undisturbed peace, letting go and drifting into the quiet.